Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 31 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In this episode, the crew left Raiatea and bid farewell to the Society Islands. Their departure was marked by emotional goodbyes, generous gifts, and the warmth of their Polynesian hosts. With Hadidi on board, now revealed to be Mahina, they sailed westward and reached the island of Ewa, part of the Tonga archipelago, once charted by Abel Tasman. Here, the reception was surprisingly open and friendly. Islanders greeted the newcomers with gifts, songs, and smiling hospitality. Georg and his companions were welcomed with coconuts, shaddock fruit, and melodic singing from the local women. The houses were neat, set in fragrant gardens, and surrounded by morning glories and cultivated orchards. The crew admired the locals' craftsmanship, the structure of their gardens, and their musical talent, which surpassed that of Tahitians in harmony and tone. Unlike in Tahiti, social distinctions on Ewa were less visible. The supposed chief was barely distinguishable by appearance, and everyone seemed to share the island's resources more equally. Toward the end of the episode, Georg described the physical appearance of the islanders, graceful, well-built, with expressive features and elaborate tattoos, even on sensitive areas. The welcoming crowd left a lasting impression, setting the stage for the next encounter on their South Seas journey.
Saturday, October 2nd, 1773, Ewa Island, Tonga.
Among the women, it was not customary to decorate themselves in the same way. Like the men, they had only 3 round marks on each arm, formed as interlocking circles, tattooed into the skin but not rubbed with black pigment. Beyond that, they were content with a few black dots on their hands. The men went nearly naked, usually wearing only a narrow strip of cloth wrapped around the hips like a sash. Sometimes it was a bit longer and hung like a skirt from the waist to just above the knees. The women, on the other hand, wore the cloth wrapped around the body just below the chest, hanging down to the calves. It was made of the same material as Tahitian cloth, but painted in rectangular patterns resembling a board game and coated with a waterproof varnish. Instead of cloth, the women sometimes wore mats, very finely woven and similar in appearance to the Tahitian ones. Occasionally, though rarely, these mats were thrown over the shoulders and chest. The men decorated themselves with a mother-of-pearl shell hanging on a cord around the neck and resting on the chest. The women wore several cords around the neck, strung with small shells, seeds, and fish teeth, with a round snail operculum about the size of a silver dollar, roughly 3.7 centimeters or 1.5 inches, in the center. Each earlobe had 1 or sometimes 2 holes. In those cases, they inserted a small round piece of turtle shell or a bone. These cylinders were often made of simple reed filled with a solid red substance and painted and stained on the outside. The most remarkable thing they noticed about this people was that many had lost their little finger, sometimes on both hands. Gender and age made no difference. Even among the few children they saw walking around, most had already been mutilated in this way. Only a few elderly individuals still had all their fingers, making them an exception to the general rule. They immediately suspected that the death of a relative or friend was the reason for this peculiar form of mutilation, a practice also found among the Hottentots in Africa, the Guarani in Paraguay, and the inhabitants of California. This suspicion was later confirmed after repeated inquiries. Another peculiarity they observed was that almost all the locals had a round mark on their cheekbones, either burned or etched into the skin with a caustic substance. Some of these marks were still fresh, others were already scabbed over, and many showed only faint traces. They were unable to discover exactly how or why these marks were made, but they suspected they came from a caustic remedy, possibly used like moxa in Japan, to treat various illnesses.
Moxa, also known as moxibustion, is a traditional healing method that originated in ancient China and is still practiced today in various parts of East Asia. It involves the burning of dried plant material, most commonly mugwort, either directly on the skin or near specific acupuncture points. The goal of moxa is to stimulate circulation, warm the body's meridians, and promote the flow of qi, or vital energy, as understood in traditional Chinese medicine. There are two main types of moxibustion: direct moxa, where a small cone is placed on the skin and burned, and indirect moxa, where the burning material is held close to the skin or attached to an acupuncture needle. Moxa is used to treat a wide range of conditions including chronic pain, fatigue, digestive disorders, cold-related symptoms, and to support general immune function. One of its most well-known applications is in turning a breech baby during pregnancy, by applying heat to a specific point on the foot. While scientific evidence for its effectiveness is still limited and debated, some studies suggest that moxa may improve blood flow and reduce inflammation. In traditional medicine, it remains a respected, non-invasive method believed to support the body's natural ability to heal.
Despite the friendly behavior of the locals, they sensed that their stay here would not last long. The captains were unable to obtain enough fresh provisions to feed the crews of both ships on a daily basis. The reason likely lay less in actual shortage and more in the fact that they had eagerly bought weapons and household items at the beginning, which led the islanders to withhold their more valuable food supplies. Although the locals occasionally brought yams, bananas, coconuts, and pomelos for sale, they soon stopped trading these goods and limited their offers to handcrafted items. The men sold the sailors an astonishing number of fishing lines, equipped with turtle shell hooks, some up to 18 centimeters, 7 inches long, similar to the witty hooks known from Tahiti. They also gave up their chest ornaments made of shell, while the women offered necklaces and bracelets made of mother of pearl, along with small round sticks of wood or reed, which they used instead of earrings. They also traded in combs, which were more decorative than practical. These were made from small flat sticks, about 12 centimeters, 4.7 inches, carved from yellow wood resembling boxwood. The tops were skillfully joined by colorful weavings of brown and black-dyed coconut fiber. They also offered baskets made of the same fibers, often woven in brown and black patterns, sometimes plain brown, and decorated with round, flat glass beads that appeared to be made from shells. The shapes and patterns of the baskets varied greatly, but they were always cleanly and tastefully crafted. In addition to these items, they also found small wooden stools, used as headrests instead of pillows, more common here than on Tahiti. There were also many shallow food bowls and spatulas used to stir breadfruit paste, all carved from casuarina wood. The sailors called this clubwood, since clubs and war maces were made from it throughout the South Sea Islands. These clubs came in many forms, some so heavy they could barely be held in one hand. The variety of weapons found among the islanders seemed at odds with the peaceful attitude they showed toward the Europeans, especially in their willingness to trade these weapons. It appeared that they often had conflicts among themselves or fought wars with neighboring islands. But Georg could not obtain any clear information about this. The locals also offered various kinds of cloth, mats, and other small goods for sale, and gladly accepted small nails or dark striped glass beads in exchange. In the afternoon, they returned to the ship and noticed that a small boat anchor had been stolen, quietly taken aside by the islanders. Still, their friendly glances and calls followed the Europeans all the way back on board, where similar goods were offered for sale from many canoes. Among the sellers were several people suffering from advanced leprosy. One man had a large cancerous sore covering his back and shoulders. A woman had lost almost her entire face. Her nose was reduced to a hole, and her swollen cheeks were oozing. Despite their suffering, these unfortunate individuals traded just as eagerly as the others. What moved the visitors most was that they were offering food for sale. After lunch, Georg stayed aboard, where Dr. Sparman helped him sort the natural specimens they had collected that morning. Meanwhile, the captains and Georg's father went ashore again to make further discoveries. At sunset, they returned from their exploration, and his father told him about their experiences. At the landing place, the locals greeted them with joyful shouts, just as they had in the morning, and trade continued to flourish, though food was scarce, and pomelos were almost entirely unavailable due to the early season. Mr. Hodges, Georg, and his servant left the trading site with two islanders who offered to guide them toward a mountain in the island's interior. The path led through many beautiful tree plantations and gardens, each enclosed by either reed fences or living hedges of flowering trees. They entered a narrow footpath between two fences, inside which, on both sides, bananas and yams were planted in neat rows, as orderly as in European gardens. This narrow way led to a large meadow covered in fine grass. After crossing the field, they reached a splendid avenue lined with 4 rows of coconut palms. It stretched about 2 kilometers or 1.2 miles and led them to another narrow path, which again passed through carefully maintained gardens. Following this valley, they came to a place where several footpaths joined. They found themselves on a meadow covered with the softest grass and surrounded by tall, shady trees. In one corner stood a house, empty for the moment, its residents likely gone to the seashore. Mr. Hodges liked the setting so much that he sat down to sketch it. The air was clear and fragrant, and a gentle sea breeze cooled them. Small birds chirped, and wild doves cooed in the shadiest branches of the tree under which they rested. This tree was remarkable in that its roots separated from the trunk about 2 meters, 6.5 feet, above the ground, and descended individually toward the soil. It bore an unusual kind of pod, over 1 meter or 3.3 feet long and 2 to 3 centimeters, or 0.8 to 1.2 inches wide. This secluded, nature-blessed place reminded them of descriptions of enchanted islands in literature, often adorned with every kind of beauty. In fact, the scene strongly resembled such romantic portrayals. They found another shaded path that led to another grassy clearing. At the end of this path, they came upon a small hill on which stood 2 huts. Around the hill, reed rods had been placed in the ground at intervals of about 30 centimeters, or 1 foot, and large casuarina trees stood before the rise. Their local guides refused to approach the hill any further, but Georg and the others climbed up, and though with difficulty, looked into the huts. In one of them they found a recently buried body, the other was empty. As on the Society Islands, the casuarina tree was also used here to mark burial places. Its dark color and drooping branches, like mournful downward-pointing needles, fit the melancholy atmosphere of such sites, much like the cypress does in Europe. The hill beneath the hut was made of small coral stones, loosely piled together and resembling a heap of river pebbles. They continued their exploration and found many more lovely groves of trees, most with dwellings at their center. In one of these gardens, their guide sat down with them and offered a few coconuts for refreshment. When they finally returned to the shore, the boats were already ready to head back to the ship, so they immediately crossed over. During their walk, they met only a few people, and those they encountered passed by without interest, usually heading toward the trading place. Without their 2 guides, they likely would have remained entirely on their own. No one would have followed them or bothered them in any way. The sound and effect of their firearms made no particular impression on the locals, but they also had no reason to frighten them with such weapons, since the people consistently behaved in a friendly and welcoming manner. The women were generally reserved and clearly showed their disapproval of the sailors' rowdy behavior. However, a few were less modest and encouraged the crew with indecent gestures to try and get whatever they wanted. The following morning they went ashore again with the captains and presented the island chief with a collection of garden seeds, whose great usefulness was explained to him as best as possible through gestures. Until then, their communication had been limited to such signs, but they had already collected enough words to recognize that the locals' language was closely related to that of Tahiti and the Society Islands. Omai and Mahina, the two men from Raiatea and Bora Bora traveling with them aboard, initially claimed not to understand the local speech at all, but after they were shown the similarities to their own language through various words, they quickly grasped the dialect and were able to communicate with the locals more effectively than Georg or any of the others could have learned in a long time. The two South Sea men liked the land very much, but they soon noticed what it lacked. They complained that there was little breadfruit, few pigs and chickens, and no dogs at all, which was true. In contrast, they enjoyed the abundance of sugar cane and the intoxicating pepper drink, which the locals had also offered Captain Cook to taste. After the captains had given their gifts, they returned to the ships, and the chief came aboard with them. They raised anchor, set sail, and left this happy island, whose beauties they had barely been able to get to know in passing. During the final preparations for departure, the island chief sold them a large number of fishing lines in exchange for nails and glass beads. Then he called over a passing canoe and said goodbye with friendly gestures and glances. They sailed along the west coast of the island Tasman had named Amsterdam, but which its inhabitants called Tonga. The island lay at approximately 21 degrees 11 minutes south latitude and 175 degrees west longitude. Compared to the previous island, the land here was very flat. At its highest points, it appeared to rise no more than 6 to 7 meters, 20 to 23 feet, above sea level. In size, however, this island was larger than Ewa. Through their telescopes, they spotted similarly regular plantations as on the other island, and the coast was full of people watching them closely. Some of the locals ran back and forth along the shore, waving white flags, which they interpreted as signs of peace and a distant welcome gesture. When they were about halfway between the two islands, around 5 to 6 kilometers, 3 to 3.7 miles from each, they encountered a few canoes with people trying to reach the ship. But the ship was too far before the wind, so the canoes couldn't catch up. Instead, they reached the Adventure and went aboard there. In the afternoon, they arrived at the northern end of the island, where to the east lay several small islands connected by a reef, and to the northwest, a hidden cliff where the sea crashed with great force. These small islands and the reef convinced them they were in exactly the same area where Tasman had anchored in 1643 and had named the spot Van Diemen's Anchorage. Here, too, they dropped anchor, although the seabed consisted only of bare coral rock. Soon they were surrounded by a crowd of locals, arriving partly in canoes and partly swimming, even though the ships lay more than 400 meters, a quarter mile, from the shore. The islanders resembled the inhabitants of Ewa in every respect and were just as eager to trade. They immediately offered a great quantity of cloth, mats, nets, household items, weapons, and ornaments for sale, gladly accepting nails and glass beads in exchange. But this trade was soon forbidden, for as soon as the ships had anchored, the captain issued an order that no one was to buy such curiosities anymore. The islanders, however, were made to understand that instead they should bring coconuts, breadfruit, yams, and bananas, as well as pigs and chickens. These items the crew had already learned to name in the local language. To give this request more weight, the few food items that could be obtained that day were paid for generously, while all other goods had to be taken back ashore untouched. The positive effects of this measure became clear the very next morning, when, at daybreak, entire boatloads of fruit and chickens arrived. Many of the islanders came aboard so confidently and trustingly, as if they had known the crew for a long time, and didn't even know what distrust was. Among them was a handsome man with very open and engaging features, who, much like their acquaintance on Ewa, seemed to hold some authority over his people. He came down into the cabin and introduced himself as Ataha. Of all the gifts he received due to his rank, he was most pleased with the iron tools and the red cloth. After breakfast, he accompanied them in the pinnace to the shore. The coast was lined with a coral reef that ran about 100 meters, a musket shot, or roughly 330 feet, off the beach and had only a very narrow entrance. Inside the reef, the bottom was so rocky and the water so shallow that they couldn't bring the boat all the way to shore and had to be carried. Once everyone was safely on land, the ship's clerk was tasked with purchasing food, assisted by a group of Marines as a guard. The islanders showed neither surprise nor dissatisfaction at this arrangement. They probably didn't realize its purpose and therefore had no reason for suspicion. They were greeted, as on Ewa, with joyful shouts and invited to sit down on the rocky shore. These rocks consisted of a type of coral stone and were covered with shell sand. Among other things, the locals brought them beautiful, completely tame parrots and doves for sale. Georg's young travel companion from Bora Bora, who sometimes called himself Mahine, sometimes Hedidi, eagerly traded for ornaments made of red feathers. He assured them that such feathers were of extraordinary value in Tahiti and the Society Islands. These feathers were often glued onto skirts woven from coconut fibers, worn by women during dances, or fastened to banana leaves and worn as forehead decorations. Hedidi was thrilled with his purchase and told them that a piece of this feather ornament, as wide as 2 or 3 fingers, would be enough on his island to buy the largest pig. He and Omai were very pleased with the inhabitants of these islands and were already beginning to understand the language quite well. After getting to know their new friends a bit better, they set out to explore the land. Not far from the shore, where the ground rose several meters above the coast, they entered a narrow but long stretch of forest made up partly of tall trees and partly of low brushwood. In some places, this forest strip was barely 100 meters, 330 feet deep, but it extended along the entire coast of Van Diemen's Anchorage. Beyond it, the land remained consistently flat. Directly next to the forest lay a strip of land about 150 meters, 490 feet wide, partly planted with yams, partly covered with grass, and with a small swamp in the center where many violet waterbirds gathered. Beyond this area, the land was divided and fenced. A narrow path, about 2 meters, 6.5 feet wide, and lined on both sides with a reed fence, ran like a country lane through the cultivated fields. Here they met many locals carrying large quantities of food to the shore, politely bowing as they passed. The fences, plantations, and houses were arranged just as they were on Ewa, and the dwellings were also surrounded by fragrant bushes. The paper mulberry tree, whose bark was used for making cloth, and the breadfruit tree were less common here than on the Society Islands. The apple tree found there was entirely unknown in this region. Instead, they had pomelos. Springtime, which adorned the plants with blossoms and brought everything to life again, surely contributed to how much they liked this land. But the diligence and good cultivation shown by the locals also played a role. It was truly satisfying to see how much order there was in the layout and planting of their properties, and how careful their craftsmanship was. Both pointed to a level of understanding and taste that suggested this people could not lack for happiness and prosperity. A field path running between the fenced lands led them to a small patch of wild woodland. Though it lacked artificial symmetry, it did not lack natural grace and beauty. A towering casuarina tree rose far above the surrounding growth and was covered with many black creatures that from a distance they mistook for crows. But upon closer inspection, they recognized them as bats. These animals hung from the branches by the claws on their wingtips and feet, often upside down, sometimes in other positions. With the first shot, they brought down 6 to 8 of them. It turned out they belonged to the vampire bat species and had a wingspan of about 1 meter, 3 feet. Disturbed from their rest by the gunfire, a few fluttered clumsily away from the tree, making a sharp whistling sound. Others came flying in from a distance, one by one, yet most remained unmoved in place. It seemed they only searched for food at night, but they likely caused great damage in the locals' orchards. as their diet appeared to consist mainly of fruit. This assumption was supported by the delight the islanders showed as the men reduced the number of these bothersome animals. The locals also knew how to catch them alive, keeping them in skillfully woven cages with funnel-shaped entrances. These allowed the animals to enter easily, but made escape impossible. They were told the creatures were very aggressive, and indeed they had large, sharp teeth. Since they knew from Tahiti, the Society Islands, and Ewa that a casuarina tree often stood near a burial site, the sight of this somber tree, made even darker by the black bats, led them to suspect that a grave must be nearby here as well. And so it was. They soon came to a beautiful grassy area shaded all around by casuarinas, pandans, wild sao palms, and other trees. One side in particular was lined with Barringtonia trees as thick as the strongest oaks, their large, beautiful blossoms mostly scattered on the ground. At the upper end of this clearing, they saw a raised platform about 1 meter, 3 feet high, bordered at the base with square-cut coral stones and equipped with 2 coral steps for easy access. The top was covered in green grass, and on it stood a hut that resembled the mortuary houses they had seen on Ewa. It measured about 6 meters, 20 feet long, 5 meters, 16 feet wide, and 3 meters, 10 feet high. The roof was made of banana leaves and reached almost to the ground. Inside, the floor was covered with small white coral pebbles, and in one corner lay a bed of black stones, about 2.5 meters, 8 feet, long and 30 centimeters, 1 foot high. An islander who entered the hut with them, while the others stayed at a distance, explained that a man was buried there. As he spoke, he pointed to the spot where his little finger was missing and made it clear that such a mutilation was performed when a family member died. Georg recalled an incident involving Mr. Wales, the astronomer, who had once met a man with no missing fingers, despite his parents likely being long dead, judging by his age. But such an individual case didn't disprove the overall pattern. There were eccentrics everywhere, and perhaps someone on Tonga Tabu had simply refused to take part in the ceremony, especially since the South Seas in general were known for their great tolerance. On this burial site, they also found 2 wooden statues which, like the itais on Tahiti, were meant to represent human figures. Yet just like there, the locals showed no particular respect or reverence for them. The figures lay carelessly on the ground and were kicked from one corner to another as needed. Such burial sites, called whaiatuka in the local language, were always located in very pleasant spots, on green, grassy clearings under beautiful, shady trees. Mr. Hodges made a drawing of the place. After they had sufficiently examined it, they continued along a path still leading between plantations. Only a few locals were seen, as most had gone to the trading area. Those they did meet either continued their work undisturbed or passed by politely. They showed no displeasure and made no attempt to prevent the men from roaming their land. On the contrary, they greeted them kindly. In various houses they visited, all were empty but neatly laid out with mats and surrounded by fragrant shrubbery. Sometimes the houses were enclosed by their own fences, separating them from the tree gardens or other plantings. These fences, like those on Ewa, had a special door that could be locked from the inside. In such cases, the fragrant shrubs were always planted inside the smaller enclosure. By now, they had covered about 5 kilometers, 3 miles, and finally saw the eastern shore of the island before them, where the coastline formed a deep inlet that Tasman had called Maria Bay.
That brings episode 31 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution to a close. A map with all the places featured in this episode is available in the show notes. For today's view of these historic locations, check out my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's path and explore how history lives on. Subscribe now so you won't miss the next stage of our adventure, because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.